in the past. Okay. Thank you very much for joining us for the session, and I'd also like to welcome everybody who's joining us. We've got Bruce McKenzie, board member at the IASB, who's going to be speaking with us today, together with the team from the IASB. We've got Aisha Akinwale, we've got Dennis Deisel, and I think we've got Rafal as well, who's going to be joining us at some point during the course of this morning. So without much further ado, I'm going to ask for them to join us. I think Bruce will start, and then as we go along, he'll hand over to the rest of the IASB staff to talk us through what is going on at the IASB and how it potentially affects all of us. And thank you very much all for participating, and we look forward to receiving your comments on this process. Thank you. Bruce.
Thanks very much, Ray, and thanks to the PARFA team for helping us host the webinar today. Just before we get started, just the standard housekeeping, if you don't mind, just to obviously point out that the views being expressed by myself, by Aisha, or by Dennis today are obviously our views, and not necessarily those of the IASB or the foundation. Also, if you are looking for the request for information we're going to talk about today, or any of the other materials, you can find those on our website, and we will chat to you a little bit later about how to access those materials. So with that, want to start off just with a couple of polling questions, just to try and get everybody, find out where everybody's backgrounds is and where you're from. So I'm hoping that the team are going to launch a polling question now. There we go. First one I'm asking you is just approximately how much experience do you have working with IFRS? I see a lot of you typing in your answers there. So nice, quick, easy one to start with. It's not an exam, we're not going to mark you on it. I'll give you probably another 10 seconds or so. Just while we're doing that, as we work through the presentation today, if you do have any questions, please do use the Q&A chat function. What we will then be able to do is either pick those up as we go along or at the end, but we will pick up on those questions. Okay, thank you for entering those. Just to see, it's quite a nice mix of people with experience across that, so we'll kind of move on from that. We had a second polling question we wanted to ask quickly, was just around which country you are from. Don't be offended if your country's not up there. There is an other, there should be another at the end there. We would just pick those up for most people who'd registered, so we just want to quickly get a feel for where people are calling in from. I'll give you another minute or so just to finish out on those. Thank you. I do see you all filling out there. Okay, so a bit of a mix from across the region. Just to point out, for those of you aren't aware, we are doing today's webinar in English. There is one in 2 weeks' time where we're doing exactly the same webinar in French. So if you are from a French-speaking country, or you know French-speaking colleagues who may be interested, please do let them know that they can attend this webinar in a couple of weeks' time in French. Right, thank you very much for filling those in. Always interesting. We're going to have a couple of questions as we move through the poll. As I said, thanks for the opportunity to PARFA for letting us speak. What we really wanted to do in this session was really highlight the main issues around the request for information that the IASB issued regarding our third agenda consultation, and really give you an opportunity to ask us questions and share some comments and thoughts with you around what we're doing. If you haven't been involved in an agenda consultation before, don't worry too much. I'm going to take you a little bit around what exactly it is and how that's going to impact on us. So just a bit of background to start off with. I firstly wanted to start by just setting the scene, something that we normally get a few people getting a bit confused about. If I start off by looking at the red box, we're talking today about the third agenda consultation. Now, what is an agenda consultation? Effectively, what we as the IASB do is every 5 years, we basically go out to all our stakeholders and say, help us set our agenda. In other words, help us prioritize what should we be working on and what should the scope of our projects be. So we're really setting our timetable for the next 5 odd years. Remember that the IASB, that's upon the red, the board that I sit on, we effectively are looking more at financial statements, even management commentary for profit-orientated companies, but that's the ambit of what we do. What the agenda consultation is different to is it's different to the strategy review that the IFRS Foundation trustees are currently doing. Now, many of you may be aware that the IFRS Foundation is consulting about potentially expanding our view and setting up a new board, probably called the International Sustainability Standards Board, which will look at sustainability reporting standards. That process is separate to this agenda consultation. And that is something the trustees are looking at. They're working through the feasibility. And if they decide they're going to do it, will be something, a separate board with their own agenda that they will most likely consult on. I just wanted to point these two things out as different because today we're not talking about sustainability and what the sustainability board will do. Today we're talking effectively about what the IASB will do. Yes, potentially there could be some overlap and there may be some issues we need to look at, but it's too early for us to be considering those. And effectively, we're going to have to wait until the trustees have decided on what the scope of the board's going to be, or the new board will be, and then see whether that impacts on the IASB. So just so we're all aware, as I said, this is very clearly more the IASB, the accounting side, not necessarily the sustainability side. Now, moving on. So what exactly is it? What we're effectively doing in this agenda consultation is we're looking to get feedback on three key elements from you. The first one is the strategic direction and the balance of the board's activities. Now we're going to talk about each of these in detail, but we want to talk to you about what is the direction we should be taking. And when I talk about balance, what are the different areas we should be focusing our time on? And we'll talk about what those areas are now. Secondly, there's a criteria for assessing the reporting of financial reporting issues. So when we decide to put something on our agenda, a financial reporting issue, what criteria are we using in assessing whether to prioritize that or not? And then thirdly, what we've also done is we've basically put a whole lot of potential projects that we're asking for your comments on. So we're saying with the projects that we've potentially got on there, we want to get some feedback on whether you think these are the ones we should add to our work plan. Now, we put the RFI out in March 2021. You've got till the end of September to comment. And I do want to point out, I think this is a very important part of our process for everybody to comment on, because we need to make sure at the end of the day that you are happy with the stuff that we're working on. Now, the comment period closes on the 27th of September. And what we will do is towards the end of the presentation, we'll talk about how you can make comment on those things. Now, once, of course, we get the feedback from everybody, we will then in the last quarter this year start talking about it and probably get a feedback statement towards 2022, and we'll start setting our agenda based on that work plan. It is important to point out that if a project doesn't get onto our work plan here, it doesn't necessarily mean that we won't look at it. There are, of course, those things that could be quite urgent for us to look at. I mean, for example, we've seen LIBOR reform come through. We've seen the COVID-19 that's impacted on us. So there are always going to be urgent projects potentially that we need to we need to put onto the agenda, and we'll address those if there's a need for them. But I think what's very important to understand is that this will be kind of the foundation project that we look at, which is why it's so important to make sure we get the right feedback from you. Now, moving on. Effectively, if you take a look at the slide, this is an overview of the request for information we're putting out. And what we've got there in that diagram are the 4 areas where the IASB can spend its time. Now, firstly, to point out that those 4 areas we talk about are not drawn to scale. We'll talk now about those. And we're going to go into each of those in detail during the presentation. But effectively, what we're talking about is we're wanting you to consult with us and let us know about 3 major areas. The first one being the strategic direction and balance. The second one, as I said, talk about those criteria, and I'll take you through those criteria around when we prioritize something that we're going to potentially put on the agenda. And then thirdly, we're actually going to go through that list of projects that we're proposing to see whether or not you think we need to look at those. So there's quite a lot that we're looking for you guys to comment on. But as I said, this is vital in ensuring that the work we do over the next 5 years meets the needs of the users and the other stakeholders within our industry. Now, with that, we're going to kick off and go into the first section, looking at our strategic direction and balance. And with that, I have the pleasure of handing over to Aisha.
Thank you, Bruce. And hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. So as Bruce said, we're going to start off with the first part of the agenda consultation, which very much focuses on strategic advice for the IASB. So when many people think of the IASB, they think of the standards, and that's completely understandable because the standards are the ultimate product that practice has to get on with. However, the IASB does a lot more than develop IFRS standards and what goes on at the board table. So as you can see on the pie chart on this slide, the IASB has 6 main activity streams. Of course, a big part of that is developing new IFRS standards and major amendments to those standards, which is in the top left quadrant. The other activities of the IASB include maintaining IFRS standards to support consistent application, developing a separate small standard for companies that do not have public accountability, and activities to promote digital financial reporting. Finally, the IASB has 2 cross-cutting activities. We call them cross-cutting because they impact all the other 4 that I've mentioned. And these cross-cutting activities are on understandability and accessibility of the standards, as well as on stakeholder engagement. So the board has a number of activities going on, but at the same time, there is limited capacity. So by capacity, we're referring to both the board's capacity and your capacity as stakeholders to engage with the board. So while the board would love to do almost everything that everyone says in sort of same gusto, the board's view is that the current level of resources that it has available will remain substantially unchanged for the 2022 to 2026 period, which is the period that this agenda consultation is trying to define for the board. So what that means is that increasing the allocation of resources to one or more of the board's 6 main activities would mean that fewer resources are available for other activities. So, there's a balancing act for the board to go through there. And as you can see at the top of this slide, we've provided estimates of how the board's resources are currently deployed across the 6 main activities. So the question we're asking stakeholders in this first part of the consultation is whether this current balance is about right, or should we make changes to the level of focus in any one of them? All right, so this is something that the board wants broad stakeholder feedback on before deciding what should be the case. So it's really important for us to know as stakeholders what activities are most important to you and you'd like to see the board do more of. What activities perhaps don't excite you as much and you think the board should spend the time more effectively elsewhere. And we'll have a polling question later on to ask for your thoughts on these key questions. But before we get to that, over the next couple of slides, what I'm going to do is share some information about what each of these 6 activities currently involve and some ideas for what more the board could do if the board were to devote more resources to them, so you can get a sense of whether you'd like to see the board do more in any one or more of these areas. So with that in mind, if we start talking about each activities in turn, and the first activity is self-explanatory. This is delivering new IFRS standards or major amendments to the standards. And so that's all about our research, our standard setting, and required post-implementation review projects. For those that might not be familiar, post-implementation reviews are a way for the IASB to essentially look back on the effectiveness of new standards or major amendments after they've been applied for some time. So the post-implementation reviews of IFRS 10, 11, and 12, fondly known as the consolidation standards, are underway. The board has also started the post-implementation review of the classification and measurement requirements in IFRS 9. And then between 2022 and 2026, the board is already planning to start the post-implementation reviews of IFRS 15 and IFRS 16, and to complete the post-implementation review of the remaining aspects of IFRS 9, being the impairment and hedge accounting requirement. So those are already part and parcel of what the board is currently doing or planning to do today. And so the board currently spends 40 to 45% of its time on this activity. More focus means that the board can add more new projects to the work plan. And in terms of what those more could look like, that's the focus of the third part of the consultation. So we'll come to those later on in the webinar. So moving on to the second activity, maintenance and consistent application. So together with the IFRS Interpretations Committee, the board helps stakeholders obtain a common understanding of financial reporting requirements in a number of different ways. And the work here really is to help support the consistent application of IFRS standards so that they are globally comparable. And as you can see on this slide, the different activities in that respect today, they include the board monitoring consistent application and working with stakeholders in order to identify and respond to application issues in a timely and effective manner. The board also addresses application challenges through agenda decisions that are published by the Interpretations Committee. And those agenda decisions essentially explain how the requirements in IFRS standards apply to a particular transaction or fact pattern. Also addressing application challenges through narrow scope amendments to certain standards, as well as by publishing educational materials. So all of those activities today, currently account for roughly 15 to 20% of the board's resources. Now, if the board were to focus more resources on this activity, it could continue doing what it already does, as you can see on this slide, as I mentioned earlier, but perhaps, more intensively. But as well, the board could address application issues and challenges through new channels. And what those new channels might include are capacity building efforts to support emerging economies or new adopters. And so things like that could involve regional IFRS training workshops, as well as case studies that develop capacity to make judgments to apply the requirements in IFRS standards, which, as we know, are largely principles-based. So if you would like to see the board do more capacity building in your country, in your jurisdiction, then maintenance and consistent application is the place to flag that. Moving on to the third activity area, which is our IFRS for SMEs standard. So the IFRS for SME standard, it's a simplified version of IFRS standards that's available for any jurisdiction to adopt, whether or not it has adopted full IFRS standards. The jurisdictions that adopt this IFRS for SME standard, they determine which entities should use the standard. The board's only restriction is that companies that have public accountability should not use the IFRS for SME standard. And by public accountability, we mean the company's debt or equity instruments are either traded or in the process of being traded on the public markets, or the company holds assets in a fiduciary capacity for a broad group of stakeholders. There are a number of reasons why the board develops the IFRS for SME standard, really. The key point being that, the IASB's IFRS Foundation's mission is to provide a single set of globally accepted accounting standards, taking into account the needs of a range of sizes and types of companies. So full IFRS is being developed with the objective of providing an accounting framework for large publicly accountable companies that are generally listed. So when people started to adopt full IFRS, they realized that there was a need for something different for smaller companies. And so the IASB responded to a need for an international demand for something to cater to the very specific requirements that smaller companies have. So in that respect, today, the board develops and maintains the standard through periodic reviews. So given that the standard is for the perspective of smaller companies, the board does not introduce frequent changes to the standard as it perhaps does for full IFRS standard. So as we speak, the second comprehensive review of the standard is currently underway. The board also publishes educational materials to support the greater understanding and consistent application of the SME standard. And all of that currently accounts for about 5% of the board's resources. In terms of what more the board can do for the IFRS for SME standard, it can focus a lot more on its consistent application, similar to what is done for full IFRS standards, essentially by working with stakeholders to identify application issues on a timely basis and taking on further work to support consistent application of the standard, including through educational materials. The IFRS for SME standard is currently required or permitted in about 86 jurisdictions, so just a little over 50% of the jurisdictions there. So if the board were to focus more resources on this activity, we could, for example, work with national standard setters and others to explore opportunities for the greater global adoption of the standard. Now moving on to digital financial reporting. So with the increase in consumption of financial reporting in digital format, we often hear calls for the board to devote more resources to considering the interplay between technology and financial reporting. And so our current focus in this respect is on supporting the IFRS taxonomy. So the IFRS taxonomy is a system that essentially allows companies to take the financial information that they reported on a paper-based format and providing that in a digital format so that users of financial statements that want to consume information digitally can do that. So the IFRS taxonomy provides the codes and the tags to allow companies to transform a paper-based financial reporting into a digital context. And the board develops that IFRS taxonomy. So our work in that respect is largely to maintain and update the IFRS taxonomy, firstly for new or amended standards. So whenever a new standard or an amended standard introduces new or changes to disclosure and presentation requirements, the board updates the IFRS taxonomy to reflect that. We also update the IFRS taxonomy to reflect common reporting practice. So we take a look out there to see whether companies are presenting or disclosing useful information to investors that are not specifically required in the standard. And to the extent that that's commonly done by a wide variety of companies, then we would be introducing and updating the IFRS taxonomy to reflect those common reporting practices. The board's work also is ensuring that when the board develops new presentation and disclosure requirements, trying to make them as technology neutral as possible. And so by technology neutral, we are referring to developing requirements that can work in both a paper-based and a digital financial reporting context. And then finally, the board takes part in broader discussions on how to improve the digital ecosystem. And so all of that work currently accounts for roughly 5% of the board's resources. Now, if we were to devote more resources to support digital consumption of financial reports, the question really becomes what further activities should the board undertake? And in particular, what activities should the board be doing to realize the benefits of high quality, globally comparable financial reporting that we see on paper today in a digital world? And we can think of that question actually from each of the three streams of work within this activity. So for instance, with respect to the IFRS taxonomy, in terms of what more here, the board could continue to do what it already does, but then doing more to improve the quality of electronic data, and then improving the IFRS taxonomy to better meet the needs of investors on the market, making it easier to sort of navigate through and find the relevant items. In terms of looking at IFRS standards for a digital world, the board could, if there are more resources if there are more resources given to this activity, the board could look at giving a greater consideration to how presentation and disclosure requirements in IFRS standards can be enhanced to facilitate digital consumption of financial reports. So I mentioned earlier that today, in this respect, what the board is largely doing is developing the technology neutral requirements. One example of more here could be moving from that technology neutral perspective to developing requirements from a technology first perspective. And so that change in perspective, one example of how that could materialize in practice is that the board might be able to require even more granular information to be presented and disclosed, because perhaps technology allows us to process lots of data in an even more efficient way. And then finally, from a digital ecosystem perspective, the board could do a lot more here too, right? So it could work more with other players in the digital ecosystem towards realizing the benefits of high quality, globally comparable financial reports for the digital world. And so that would mean identifying partners that control adoption of the IFRS taxonomy, those that control the quality of electronic data, as well as, maybe those that facilitate the easy accessibility of digital reports, and really working in partnership to sort of bring, the globally comparable financial reports for a digital world to fruition. So many opportunities here to increase our level of focus on digital reporting from the current roughly 5% resource spend. So our pie chart, the circle that I put up a couple of slides back, I mentioned contained two cross-cutting activities. One is understandability and accessibility, and the other is stakeholder engagement. So starting first with understandability and accessibility, I mean, improving the understandability and accessibility of IFRS reporting requirements is already an area that the board is active. So looking closely at understandability, the board's work here really is primarily about helping those we call the users of the standards. And so we're referring to companies, auditors, regulators, national standard setters, right? So the work here is about helping those users better understand the requirements so that they can in turn provide information that is most useful to investors, to users of the financial statement. And here, you know, when standards are unnecessarily technically complex, it actually increases the risk of misapplication of the standard and risk that, you know, less useful information is provided to investors. So within the context of individual projects that the board has on its work plan, the board really takes care to reduce unnecessary complexity and cost while improving the quality of information for investors. In addition, you know, we put in a lot of effort to ensure that our requirements are clearly drafted, and in that respect, we leverage the expertise of our internal editorial and translation teams, as well as external reviewers that take a look at drafts of our consultation documents, final standards, before they are finalized and issued to the public. Now, if the board were to increase the level of focus on this activity, right, we could, for example, take firstly a holistic, you know, look at the different areas and causes of unnecessary complexity in our requirements today, right? So sort of take a stock take at you know, areas that people are finding unnecessarily complex in the standard. And what that review could then identify is a number of things, right? It could identify that there is a need for us to amend some of these existing requirements to reduce, you know, said areas of unnecessary complexity. Or indeed, it could identify the need for the board to change the way standards are developed so that they're more clearly articulated, they use more consistent terminology and structure where it's practical and helpful, of course, to do so. And that approach, you know, changing approach for the way things are drafted could then be applied to amend existing standards or on a go-forward basis when developing new standards. Accessibility. So with accessibility today, you know, we publish annotated versions of the standards. So those annotated versions allow stakeholders to see full IFRS standards with annotations and cross-references to other material, such as, for example, agenda decisions that explain how, you know, requirements apply to particular facts and circumstances. I also hope that you've had the opportunity to experience our new IFRS website, which includes tools for easier navigation of the electronic version of our standards. If you haven't had the time to look at it, I'd really encourage you to do so, because it sort of makes it easier for you to go through the standards and, you know, identify the particular areas that you're interested in. In terms of what more we could do here, it's really leveraging more on our technology and other tools, right? So looking to incorporate things like flowcharts and further tailoring tools that allow you as stakeholders to find the materials that are most relevant to you and help you understand how those materials relate to each other. And then finally, the activity on stakeholder engagement. I'm sure you all appreciate this, right? So events like this allow us the opportunity to get out there and engage with stakeholders on the board's activities, get views on the project proposals and promote acceptance of the standards. Again, at the bottom of this slide, you can see examples of further initiatives the board could pursue if additional resources were devoted to this activity. That could include, increasing engagement with broader range of stakeholders and different stakeholder types, could include increasing the use of digital means like surveys to increase engagement on consultations rather than relying solely on the traditional comment letter process. So that completes our explanation of the board's 6 main areas of activity. So hopefully that's giving you a bit more insight into what the board does and what the board could do. So now we're going to ask you to indicate which of the board's main activities you think the board should increase the level of focus on. And so there's a polling question up now to sort of get your views on that. So for options A to F here, the first 6 options, you can pick more than one answer. But clearly, if you pick broadly maintaining the current balance of activities, you should only vote for the last option. And I'm seeing the results pop up. Just going to give it a couple of minutes. I know there's a lot more of you than are voting. So if you can see the polling question up, I'd encourage you to cast your votes. So I think we have about half of the results in. I'm just going to give it a couple more seconds before I share the results of the polls. They're still trickling in, so I'm going to give everyone the opportunity to share what they think. All right, I'm going to, can we pull up the results for everyone to see? It's quite interesting results. I think we have a mix of pretty much increasing the level of focus across almost all of the activity. So, understandability, accessibility, and the IFRS for SME standard are ranking quite high. And then new IFRS standards and major amendments and maintenance and consistent application afterwards. And then some 28% of you think stakeholder engagement should be increased. So thank you for those results. And then if we maybe move on to the second or the next polling question, which I think is sometimes a bit more challenging. So as I mentioned earlier, increasing the focus in one area would mean that we have less resources for other aspects. So our next polling question is asking you then, which of the board's main activities should the board decrease its focus on? So similarly, unless you think the current balance of activities is about right, and in that case, you vote for the last option, which I think based on the last polling result might not be the case, but do cast your votes on where you think the board should reduce its level of focus on. And those are coming in fast, so thank you. All right, so if we wanted to maybe put up the polling results. Thank you. So it seems 52% of you think the current balance of the board's activities is about right, which I think is interesting given the last polling question that we raised. But the next 23% of you think that we should be reducing the level of focus on new IFRS standards and major amendments to IFRS standards. And that doesn't necessarily surprise me. It's consistent with what we've been hearing in other forums as well. Bruce, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to these polling results.
No, it's very interesting to see. I mean, the one that didn't surprise me, I guess, out of the African region is obviously there's quite a need to do the IFRS for SME standard. Both in the first one, it came quite strongly, and in the second one, obviously not an area we should decrease. And I think that's encouraging. I mean, we know that the IFRS for SMEs is quite well used across the region. And yeah, it is a project that we're obviously working on at the moment. So I think that was encouraging as well.
Thank you. Okay, thank you all for your engagement there. And I think with that, Bruce, I'm going to hand it over to you for the criteria.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Aisha. I mean, I'm hoping you've all now got a bit of a context of what we actually do at the IASB and the different areas that we focus on. I just want to reiterate one point that Aisha did raise up front, and that is that we wish we could do it all. We don't have the resource. And I think that what that means that we need to make sure that when we are starting to look at what projects we bring onto our agenda, we need to have criteria to decide on how we decide to prioritize one issue versus the other. Now, if we take a look at the pie chart that Aisha had taken us through, we're just going to kind of look a little bit at that red area now and focus in a bit more on why do we put, or when do we decide to put a project on that we're either going to issue or amend a standard for. And what we're effectively doing is we're saying, so what are the criteria we should use in deciding to put a project onto our work plan? Now, effectively, if we look at the next slide, you'll see that there are 7 criteria that we use in deciding when to put something on. Now, starting off at the top, there's an overarching consideration. And that is that obviously when we're going to put something onto our agenda, we need to decide whether that project will meet the investor's needs and also obviously take into account the cost of producing such information. I mean, these are things that we need to kind of have as an overriding principle. Within that, there are then these 7 criteria that we take a look at and we kind of say, applying them, and there's no preference for one or the other, but in applying these, we decide, are certain projects, should they be put onto our agenda or shouldn't they? Now, if we just look through them quickly, I mean, those are firstly, the importance of a matter to investors. Remember, investors are probably the most key demographic, the key users in terms of financials. So you need to make sure that we're doing a project that's important to them. Secondly, whether there's a deficiency in current reporting. So do we think that this is something that's actually needs to be fixed? Thirdly, the type of companies affected and the jurisdictions where the matter is more prevalent. Fourthly, how pervasive the matter is. And just to comment on the fourth one, that's something I know that when I was on the interpretations committee always becomes an issue around, is a matter pervasive? In other words, is it widespread? So we would love to pick up every accounting issue we can, but if there's one specific issue that only impacts a very small industry in Botswana, for example, it's very difficult for us to allocate a whole lot of resources to fixing that when there's obviously other issues that impact everybody globally. And unfortunately, those are the kind of things we need to take into account. In addition, we also look at the potential project's interaction with other projects. So we see where there's an overlap between them, the complexity and feasibility of the potential project, and whether we can get to a solution on it. And of course, the capacity of the board and its stakeholders to progress that project to actually get it to a resolution. Now, these are subjective, and the way they apply will obviously be very different to everybody. And different people in different jurisdictions and different entities in different industries will all have different things that are important to them. So for example, I could turn around and say, to me, cryptocurrency is the most important thing in my country because it's a massively growing industry. It's vitally important to investors. And we just don't believe the current accounting meets the needs of investors. Whereas if you're in a country where cryptocurrency doesn't apply at all, or it's very minor, then of course you would have a different assessment. So there's no way, we don't weight these, we don't have a science around how we can do it, but these effectively are the criteria we say, when we're looking to put a project on, these are the things that we will take into account. And to be honest, over the last couple of agenda consultations, these are the ones that have worked well in terms of deciding how we put something on and when we don't. Now, in terms of the 7 that I put up there, as well as obviously the overarching consideration, we had a question we wanted to ask, and that, do you think these are the right criteria? And if they aren't the right criteria, do you think there are other ones that we should put on? So I'm going to ask the PAFA team just to launch the next polling question to ask us, do you think that we've got the right criteria? Is the polling question up? Yeah, there we go. Yes, no, or I don't know. Okay, we'll give you a minute just to quickly tell us your views on that. So far, looks like we're definitely getting a positive answer. As I said, that somebody clicked no. As I said, this is one of the things we're asking. Now, while you're doing that, I'm just going to point out that a lot of people don't give us, a lot of people when I was talking about the agenda consultation, focus on the third area, which is the list of projects that Dennis is going to take you through now. And I think what's very important is we really are encouraging people to make sure they do give us comments on these first two areas, on obviously the mix of work that the board is doing and the criteria, even if it's just to say, yes, we think the criteria is right or wrong, because these are the kind of cornerstones, these are the foundation of what we're going to use in deciding what projects need to go on. I think that's good in terms of the polling. I mean, we can end that poll. If you want to know, if you want to share the results, you can see overwhelmingly people think we've got them right. And I'm glad to hear that, because I do actually think that, I think the criteria are working quite well in terms of what we're going to do. Good. So with that in mind, we've kind of set the background in terms of what we're doing and of course the criteria we use in deciding when to put something on. The third one of the request for information now looks at financial reporting issues that we have identified that could potentially be added to our work plan. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Dennis to take us through the third point.
Excellent. Thanks, Bruce, and good day to everybody. It is a privilege with this digital platform that I can be sitting in London and speaking to so many of you across the Africa continent, looking at where all of you are sitting. I'm hoping you're having a great day and keeping safe. So yeah, let's move on to the third and sort of the final objective area of the agenda consultation. And as Bruce mentioned, it really focuses on the priority of new financial reporting issues that could be added to the board's work plan then for the period of 2022 to 2026. I want to reiterate a little bit what Bruce just said is I think our minds, when we think about new standards and projects, tend to zone in on this area of the document. But what was just discussed is really sort of the entryway into these projects, because I think, as Aisha also alluded to, there's a balancing act that needs to be done between what we really want to achieve and the resources that we have available. So maybe, Aisha, if I can ask, if we go to the next slide, I think if we project forward now to 2026, the activities here will include continuing the projects that are already on the board's work plan. Now, these projects were previously identified as priorities in the previous agenda consultation, and the board's leaning is that in reprioritizing those projects could lead to inefficient sort of starts and stops in those projects. So the idea is these projects will continue to carry on. The next set of activities that will also still be active and going on, we do have several post-implementation reviews that needs to be done as required by the IFRS Foundation's Due Process Handbook. And you'll see the standards that are up for a post-implementation review, and we expect to start these during the 2022 and 2026 period. Now, sort of the third block, you'll notice, I think in our past experience, it shows that urgent and sometimes time-sensitive issues arise in between the agenda consultations that the board then needs to address and devote resources to. You might be aware that, for example, recently there was a interest rate benchmark reform, or the IBOR reform projects that the board needed to give attention to. Also, the COVID-19 rent concessions project, amending some of the requirements in our IFRS standard on leases. And that came up after the 2015 agenda consultation. So I guess it's important then that we understand we need to build in some contingency time for projects like these that just on an unforeseen basis pop up. So I guess pulling all these projects in sort of the gray blocks on the slide into perspective. So these need to keep going. So then in the blue block on the right, if we assume that, as Aisha mentioned up front, if we assume that we still devote a 40 to 45% resource allocation to this activity, and and I guess it was quite interesting, the view that 23% of you thought maybe it should decrease. But if we assume the 40 to 45% allocation of resources remains for this activity, we find that our capacity to work on new projects is about limited to, we would say, 2 to 3 large projects, maybe 4 to 5 medium projects, maybe 7 to 8 small projects, or I guess if you want to do some maths, a equivalent combination of those. So maybe then, Aisha, if we move to the next slide. So what you'll find then in the document is you will find sort of what the projects the board has put on the table. Now to develop this, and for stakeholders like yourself to help answer the question about the financial reporting issues that should be added perhaps to the board's work plan, the request for information really describes and sizes the potential new projects, which I'll explain a little bit of what I mean by size. But it's really to help you think about, you know, the quantity of projects we can add to the agenda given its size. So the list of described issues was put together mainly through a discussion with our consultative groups. And I guess the objective of putting this list together was primarily to provide stakeholders and the board with sort of a common understanding of the issues that could be addressed in a potential project. So it's giving the ideas or the thoughts to stakeholders to consider. I guess it's important to mention that it's not an exhaustive list, and also it doesn't represent an already draft work plan, i.e. this is what we are going to do. So just to reiterate again, it's sort of impossible for the board to undertake all of the projects that's listed in the document. And I guess more importantly, we are really keen to hear from you on the projects that you think are priority for the board. And your feedback then could also include issues that we have not described in the request for information. So in other words, when we talk about a certain project, like on the statement of cash flows, you'll see we list some of the areas that are of concern that people are thinking of, but you can add others. All right. I guess, yes, thanks, Aisha. If we then go to the next slide, these on screen are the 22 projects that the request for information document describes. And it also then sets out the scope of the project and whether it's likely to be small, medium, a small or medium or large project, right? So I think, again, just to help us to ensure that we are all on the same page when you give us your views, and when we look at the outcomes of the consultation. So it's really that sort of connecting point where we can just make sure we're speaking about the same things. If we, for example, again, you mentioned cash flows, we know what you're speaking about or what you're talking about. So it's a common ground. Now, let's maybe take one of those projects, like the statement. If you look at the statement of cash flows. Now for the, it's that sort of bottom left. Sorry, I didn't quote it for a second. It's bottom left of the screen. If we take that project, for example, what could the board do? Firstly, it could focus on just providing better information about operating cash flows. Maybe the project would be split into disclosures about the ongoing maintenance and ongoing maintenance expenses and maybe growth spend. That project would be a smaller project. Then we could do a targeted project to improve certain aspects of IAS 7, the standard dealing with the statement of cash flows, perhaps providing additional information about non-cash movements. Now, a project like that would be more of a medium-sized project. Or indeed, if you think, okay, no, well, the statement of cash flows needs maybe a more comprehensive overall review, you know, that would be a large project. So I hope that example gives you a flavor. So for each of these projects, it's really important that we understand what is the specific need or the area that you think is of importance. And that in a way describes then what is the resources that will need to be allocated to it. In other words, whether it's a small, medium or large project. So with the financial reporting issues, the question in the request for information at the top of the screen is how you would prioritize the potential projects described sort of as high, medium or low, and explain then the reasons for your prioritization. Again, maybe if you have other financial reporting issues that the board should consider for inclusion, please also include those. Now, to give you just a quick flavor of what we've been hearing, I want to do that, but while I do that, I'm going to ask that maybe we're heading into a new polling question, but before we go into the polling question, while I give you sort of a flavor of what we've been hearing, maybe what I'm going to ask you to do is have a look on the topics on the screen. There are 22 of them. Run your eyes across the screen and maybe select your top 3. Just projects. Unfortunately, the polling will not allow us to now disaggregate between small, medium, and large projects or give more detail, but just your 3 top topics or projects listed on the slide. If you could just maybe make a note of those. So while you do that, let me give you a flavor of what we've been hearing. So the intangible assets have been very popular. Some people have suggested that the board develops better disclosure requirements of unrecognized intangibles, while others say a comprehensive review of that standard is really needed. As I've been mentioning, the statement of cash flows and cryptocurrencies are also frequently mentioned. Another area that's popped up relate to climate-related risks, but bear in mind that relates to how it impacts the amounts in the financial statements. For example, looking at your source, at the sources at measurement uncertainty, and maybe testing assets for impairment. It is not the broader project of how the effects of sustainability. So it's really about the financial aspects of it. So yeah, in summary, I guess intangible assets, statement of cash flows, cryptocurrencies, and climate-related risks. Those are sort of the messages we've been hearing. All right, so I hope you've got your 3 in mind, because what I'm going to ask the PAFA team, could you bring up our polling question 6, please? And then I'm going to ask you to now what you'll see is on screen there are 3 polling questions, but what we needed to do is we couldn't list all 22 under one question. So what I'm going to ask you to do is the top 3 that you've already selected, find them in whichever question they are and select them for us and vote. In other words, please, you don't need to select 3 under each of the polling questions where you're looking for your top 3 that you have now thought about and identified. I hope that makes sense. So find your top 3 and just click that top 3. It doesn't matter where it sits under which question. And then I'll give some time for that. Sure, seeing activity all over almost on all projects, so we'll see. Bruce, maybe while people are voting, do you want to add some flavor? Is there any key messages that you've heard that you want to share with constituents?
I mean, it's interesting. Just I'm trying to look through the polls as well and see the ones that are coming up quite strongly. I mean, it's I see statement of cash flows has come up. That's one I've heard a lot about. I think it's given we're already doing that project on performance reporting at the moment. We're looking at IS1. I think it wouldn't surprise me. A lot of people want us to look at that one. Intangible assets seems to be coming up, but as well, that's quite important. And cryptos. I mean, it's interesting. Cryptos is something that we've definitely seen a lot of people saying that it's, I think, quite forward-looking. It may not be the biggest issue right now for people, but I think a lot of people are perceiving that this could be a very, very big issue in 2 to 3 years' time. And given it takes us 2 to 3 years to get a major project like that out, very much could be something. So interesting to see that.
Yeah. I want to give a little bit more time. We're on 35% of the votes. Maybe Aisha, just from your side, anything that you want to mention that's from your outreach on being on the project that you can share with the participants?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've covered it in terms of, what we've been hearing pop-ups over intangible assets as been popping up quite a lot. And I can see that, about 30% of those that are voting so far seem to echo that. Cryptos and related transactions, as mentioned, seems to be very popular with this group. So yeah, I think we're hearing consistent messages between what the top ones I can see coming up from this group and what we've been hearing so far.
Thank you. I see inflation is also featuring a little bit, I guess, understandably, a little bit higher.
Yeah, variable and contingent consideration is interesting as well. I'm saying 43% of people mentioning that.
Well, that one pops up over many standards, so it's not surprising.
Right.
I mean, just to point out something that Dennis did say earlier, and I would strongly encourage, remember when you do, and hopefully you do a response to us on what you think we should be doing, remember, it's not limited just to these projects. You may feel we need to deal with inventories, and that may be the biggest thing for you. So please do make sure that you include those others. I see some of you have clicked something else. I think that will be important as well to hear what those other topics could potentially be.
Agreed.
Climate-related risks also comes up quite strongly, which is quite interesting.
Yeah.
Ray, you're a bit soft there.
So climate-related risks also comes up quite strongly, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, which is, I think, Aisha, as you mentioned, that's sort of what we've heard that as well. It's come through as a topic. All right, we're at 51%. Just for the sake of I can sit and watch you vote the whole day because I love this stuff. But maybe for the sake of time, if we can close the polls, I'm just scanning through it. Thank you so much for giving your thoughts. So where are we? So I think we've, as we say, climate. Cryptocurrency seems to be the, if I may call it, the winner at 54% of those who voted. Inflation at 40%. And then there's a big one for statement of cash flows, 69%. Variable contingent consideration, Aisha, as you mentioned. Income taxes, government grants, I'm looking for the 30s. All right. Sure. No, thank you everybody for your participation. And Bruce, yeah, that's my section done. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much, IASB staff, for your presentations. There's got a few questions that have come up, which I'd like to direct to some of you. I guess we start off by directing the first one to Bruce, I guess as the board member on the call. This is a question from, I apologize if I mangled your name, Sumichi Mitsui. How does the IFRS Foundation plan to progress digital reporting under the policy of the technological neutral policy, I guess? I believe that this is very important but difficult. Do you have any practical initiatives, Bruce?
I'm not 100% certain about the technologically neutral product policies. It's not something I'm very familiar with. But I mean, I guess if I just talk a little bit around to the digital reporting, I mean, the IASB, well, the IFRS Foundation as a whole, we're kind of very committed at the moment to what's happening in the area of digital reporting. And as you know, we spend quite a lot of time making sure that the IFRS taxonomy is out there and it's being utilized. I mean, I guess this is one of the questions we're also asking in terms of this agenda consultation is, I mean, how much time should we be spending on that? Do you think it's something we should spend more time on, or do you think it's something we should spend less time on? I've had some people comment to me and saying in terms of what we do as the foundation, they don't believe we should be doing anything in this area. And that this is something you should be leaving to the technology guys, leaving to the ERP providers, and let them deal with that. We just deal with the accounting. On the other side, I've had some people saying we should be doing more in that space because the old paper-based accounts probably in the next 5 to 10 years won't exist as everything moves online. So I do think that the ISBs, I personally think we have a role to play in terms of making sure that we are kind of keeping ourselves and what we're doing on the forefront of what's happening in digital reporting. And I'm hoping that through the agenda consultation, we get support from that from our stakeholders.
Good. Thank you, Bruce. Next question is from Richard Tawia. In recent times, academics seem to be raising concerns about how the IASB tend not to consistently engage them in standards formulation and amendments and revisions. to what extent does the IASB engage accounting scholars and academics in their activities? Aisha, can I direct this question to you? Because I know you've been involved in a lot of the outreach programs over the last little while.
Yes, of course. Thanks, Raymond. And yes, we've been doing lots with academics. So in terms of how we work with academics for consultation documents, we make a point to sort of reach out to our academic contacts to see if there is any relevant research that the board should be considering. So, one of the exposure drafts that I'm very much involved in, which is looking at how the board can improve the disclosure requirements in IFRS standards and how they're set up. One of the aspects of work there is looking at academic research on the usefulness of disclosures in financial statements, taking particular standards as test cases. So we're working very much in tandem with academics there. And we do actually have on our board, we have 2 academics represented on the board. So, they provide that perspective. And we also have an academic department in the organization with, a dedicated academic staff that sort of keeps in contact, direct engagement with academics staff. So, and, along with that, there are a number of other organizations that, the IASB interacts with in terms of putting together academic specific events throughout the course of the year. So whether that is in connection with a particular consultation or outside of the consultation, webinars like this that we're currently doing with you, we hold academic specific webinars touching on particular areas that could be of interest for the academics and that the board can get useful input on. I think the one thing that I would encourage you to do there is, if this question is coming from an academic, on our IASB website, you have the opportunity to sort of click and navigate to get news alerts and webinars on particular different types of events. So I encourage you to look at our website to sort of stay up to date in terms of when we have academic events, webinars, or news alerts going out. And you can sort of maybe through contact with PAFA, we can share some of those directly with you. But there is lots that the board is doing to strengthen the relationship with academics, from our own board member academics to staff members that are from an academic background and doing dedicated academic events of that nature. So hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you, Aisha. I'm hoping that you can all hear me better now. I actually did have headphones on, but anyway, let's move on. Since Dennis, can I direct this next question to you? Since going concern is so important in financial reporting, at which point will more attention be paid to sustainability of the accounting in enterprise digital platforms and the extent to which these impact going concern and not just cash flow? I'm hoping I'm not throwing you under the bus.
No, thank you, Ray. But this is an interesting question, and I'll definitely ask Aisha, being more closely on the project, to also share any thoughts she has. What I can offer is it sounds like the question is after, the type of, apart from maybe just cash flows, other factors that one might need to consider to assess going concern. So I hope I'm capturing the essence of the question correctly. And in the agenda consultation in Appendix B, the sort of the different areas around going concern that the board through each consultant that the bodies have heard about, the questions around going concern is laid out. One of them being, I guess, the current requirements of how management should assess the going concern basis. And then along with that, also, as I mentioned, it indicates, different things you could do given different project sizes. So I guess if the participant feels strongly about that type of aspect, that's something that could feed into their comment letter. Aisha, do you have a different perspective, maybe a little bit more educated perspective than mine?
No, I think you've covered that. I mean, the going concern is one of the projects that we've listed as some of the things we heard before the consultation, and we're certainly asking for feedback on the relative priority of that compared to the other projects. So yes, if you do feel strongly about a going concern project and you have ideas on the specific issues that you'd like to see the board covered in the going concern, certainly please write us a comment letter. And as we'll sort of look later, there's also a survey option that you can do. So really encourage you, if you have a going concern, Priority project, this is the place for us to hear that.
Thank you, Raymond.
Thank you, Isha. Thank you, Dennis. The question from Sharon. Bruce, I think if you can pick this one up. In terms of understandability, and perhaps this is more towards the SMME space, and I know you've been involved in this space, Bruce, in the past, so I think that's why I thought this would be appropriate for you. The application of the current standards rendered the accounts completely non-functional for some businesses. For example, if it's an institute or a foundation or a trust that is dependent on major donations, there is no requirement to provide an income statement by project, and the auditors actively discourage this. The members or users of the financial statements actually require this, and there should be an opinion at this level. Can this be considered? I don't know if you can answer this question at all, Bruce.
Well, I'll give it a bash anyhow. I mean, we hear this a lot, and I think what people need to remember is that the IFRS standards really are written, remember, for profit-orientated entities. So I think that's the starting point. So when you start getting to things like foundations or trust, and a lot of those, of course, are non-profit organizations, there are some challenges, because where we look at a profit-orientated types of transactions, we don't always have accounting to help with all of those. So they can be used by non-profit organizations. I mean, anybody can use the standards, but bear in mind that sometimes the language doesn't fit completely. Where people are saying, well, actually what somebody wants is additional disclosure. Remember, under IFRS, you can always give additional disclosure. So what a company should be asking themselves, whether it's a trust, a foundation, or a major listed company, is what are the needs of our users? And if I'm a foundation, as was mentioned in the example, and I know that my users require an income statement by project, then I should be giving it. And where we're saying the auditors actively discourage that, I'm not convinced I would support that. I mean, if you can show that in your country, in your industry, that is what the users are requiring, that is what they're definitely wanting, then I think it's what a company should be trying to give them. Remember, you're always worried about the users of your financial statements. I mean, at the end of the day, these are the people you're preparing the accounts for. So I guess bring that back to the foundation. I mean, we haven't dealt with these types of entities, and if many of you out there feeling we do need to start dealing with things like non-profit organizations, well, yes, you can obviously submit that, and it'll be interesting to see whether or not there's a great need for that globally, and whether we should put that in our agenda. So you can submit on that. But I mean, as I say, as far as the question goes there, I don't think that we would necessarily turn around and say, no, you can't put something in if you could show strongly that's what your users wanted. But yeah, give us the comment in terms of in the agenda consultation if you think that's important.
Thank you, Bruce. Can I direct the next question back at you again? This one talks to sustainability reporting, but before I get there, I just want to encourage people that have not asked any questions at this point in time, if you could just ensure that you type your questions in the Q&A section of the platform, then we'll direct the questions to the IASB staff. So Bruce, the next question back at you again. What is the progress that's been made by the IASB in areas of value reporting, integrated reporting, and sustainability reporting? I mean progress in terms of possible merging of the value with the value reporting foundation, finalizing standards on integrated reporting, sustainability reporting, and value reporting.
Thanks, Ray. So as I briefly touched on earlier, the trustees at the moment are obviously consulting widely in terms of the setting up of the IASB, the International Sustainability Standards Board. And I think the scope of what that board will work on, who may potentially become part of it, that's still early days. That we don't, not quite at the stage where I think we can rush out and say, this is exactly how it will work. These will be the people involved. These will be the organizations involved. I think I would say the foundation's making big strides towards it. And if you look at the releases from the trustees, you'll see that they really have been spending a lot of time on setting up this new sustainability board. The aim is to make an announcement at the COP conference in November. So in November, we will have a much greater understanding of where the IASB is going and how this potential new sustainability board will be set up. But I think as for what we will incorporate, exactly what the scope of that board will be done, it's too early days to make that decision. Just to reiterate what I did say earlier, remember that is something outside of this agenda consultation and outside of what we as the IASB do. We're dealing with the financial reporting. There will be a separate board dealing with sustainability. So unfortunately, not something I will necessarily be doing on a daily basis, being on the accounting side.
Thank you, Bruce. Just a comment from Shadir. I just say thank you for the great presentation. Then something from Elimenia. This is from Elimenia from Nigeria. Many companies in Nigeria still make use of assets whose values have been written off due to depreciation. Why can't scrap values be recognized in the financial statements? I guess it's a little bit left field at the moment, and I don't know which of the three of you would like to take this one. Aisha, could I maybe throw it at you? And I think this is talking to IAS 16 and more than it is anything else.
Fortunately, that's not my expertise. So not to avoid the question, but at risk of providing an incorrect answer, I might ask Bruce or if you'd like to take that one.
So this is a very, very common question. I almost feel like I should post this back to Ray, because I'm sure he's had this question more than any of us in terms of having to deal with this. I mean, from what I see, the simple question here is why, we've got a situation where companies in applying I-16 have got assets written off to zero, but they're still using it. That kind of becomes a situation of how you apply I-16. And I mean, I'm not going to get into the accounting on that now, but I think the major challenge to point out there, remember, is that I-16 requires you on a continual basis to be revising useful lives, revising residual values of assets as they keep going along. And obviously, if companies are, the biggest problem we generally see is that companies use tax years to write it off. So if my tax says I can write off a computer in 3 years, I write it off in 3 years. The problem is most of us are probably using computers which are way longer than 3 years as far as their useful lives go. And remember that the tax write-off period and the useful life may not necessarily be the same. So you end up having all these assets that are still being used, but companies have written them off. I guess the reality of that is it's how you apply I-16 and whether you think we need to look at that. From what we talked about today, my comment would be if you think that I-16 accounting is something we need to address, it wasn't listed as one of the 22. That I remember, no, it wasn't, is one of the 22 projects we need to take a look at. And if you do think asset accounting as a whole is something we need to look at, do send it in. We can try and include that within the agenda consultation. But as far as that, the question goes, I think you need to just be conscious that, it's very difficult, because what you're really talking about there is how you've applied I-16 and whether you believe you've applied I-16 correctly. And of course, remember, you've still got to bring materiality into it. So I can't get all into this in huge detail, because we could probably spend the next half an hour just talking about that issue alone. But yeah, it is a challenge for a number of people in a number of jurisdictions.
Thank you, Bruce. Just another question here from Roland. How are we to incorporate climate-related risks in the digital kind of financial reporting? Now, I don't know which of the three of you wants to pick this one up.
I'm happy to pick that up again. So, I mean, at the moment, as I said, we haven't quite decided what the sustainability board will be doing. But I think this will be one of the things that they'll be addressing. Remember, as I mentioned earlier, we do have the XBRL project that looks at producing the IFRS XBRL taxonomy. My assumption would be that somewhere along the line, once we get sustainability reporting standards out and those are being adopted, I would assume we probably look at a project to also produce a sustainability standards XBRL pack to incorporate that into digital reporting. But as I said, a bit early days for us to be able to say exactly how that will look or when that will be available.
And just one last comment from Nelson. I think this is in addition to what Bruce said earlier on. It says we can use hybrid engagements for nonprofit organizations. I guess nonprofit organizations is a space that does not really have a particular kind of framework that one can say, well, this is what we are going to use. So you can pretty much do whatever you choose to do there, unless it's maybe in your jurisdiction it's dealt with by legislation. So the answer there can be various. But I think if you're looking at to apply IFRS, I think Bruce did give us the answer earlier on. I don't know if anybody's got anything else that they want to add on to that, any of the IASB staff? All right, good. Thank you very much, everybody, for your questions and your comments. I'm hoping that you can all hear me a little bit better now. Antonio, I see your comments. I apologize for my sound if it's been horrible, but I have tried to see if I could change it. And just something that I'd like to say before we all disappear, we all end this call. Just to say thank you very much to the IASB staff who've joined us this morning for the presentation, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us as well. well, I think we got to 170, I think, at the highest is what I saw. All 170 of you who joined us this morning. And I'd just like to encourage you all to please comment whenever there are any papers, any documents, any discussion papers, exposure drafts that are out there for comment, to please comment. We do want to hear what you've got to say on the standards as PAFA, so that we can take those views forward to the IASB. And the IASB themselves, I think the whole reason why they're on the call this morning is to enable us to understand what's going on in their space, and also to hear directly from us in terms of, where we're finding that, things are working, things are not working, and how things can be improved, because I think that's what will make the standard setting process that much more inclusive, and certainly it will enable us to have our views heard and our views incorporated into whatever standards are finally put out there. So just a word of encouragement from me to all of you. But thank you very much for participating, and thank you, Bruce, thank you, Aisha, thank you, Dennis, and thank you to everybody else from the IASB staff who is on the call at the moment.
Thanks very much, Ray. From our side, thank you so much. Just one last thing to mention in terms of that slide you're looking at. Please do remember that there are a number of ways you can find out about the project. So we have got all the information available on the website. You can see the links there. Also, just remember, if you are looking to submit a comment letter, you can do it online via the website. You can email it. But very importantly, I just want to also point out that there is a survey. So if you don't want to sit and have to type up an entire letter, we've got a survey link there. You can go to that. It is on our website, and you can complete your response by survey, which I think will be a lot easier for a lot of people than just drafting those. Other than that, thanks to the superb team and Aisha and Dennis for presenting on this, and thanks to Ray and to all the team at PAFA, and hopefully we'll see you guys again at another PAFA event soon. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Cheers all.
Bye.